From Capital News, Illinois, a discussion this week about liberalism. What is it, and how did it become such a pejorative word? We'll talk with the author of a new book on that subject on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello, and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. I'm Peter Hancock. The word liberal gets thrown around a lot in our political discussion these days, and rarely in a good way. Republicans love to hang that label on Democrats or even on fellow Republicans that they think are not conservative enough. Democrats shy away from the label or try to come up with some other way to describe their own political philosophy. My guest this week is the author of a new book that tries to explain how it hasn't always been that way, how the word liberal used to imply a positive attribute, and how over the course of many years its meaning has changed and Americans' opinion of liberalism has soured. Kevin Schultz is a professor and chairman of the history department at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His book carries the provocative title, Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals, a History. Professor Schultz, thank you for being here.
And thanks for having me, Peter.
So when I first saw the title of this book, my immediate thought was that this was maybe just another flash in the pan sort of political diatribe by some pundit, a book that hits the New York Times bestseller list for about 15 or 20 minutes and then disappears. That is not what this book is. It is, in fact, a history, not just of the word liberal or liberalism, but really kind of a history of a big part of the political conversation in this country since the end of World War II. So take us back to the beginning. Where did the word liberal come from? How did it enter our political vocabulary?
Peter, I don't know if I should be offended or flattered. I wish it was on the bestseller list of the New York Times. It briefly had an Amazon #1 new release, which made me happy. But beyond that, you are right. It is more of a sort of a longer, deeper dive into the history of liberalism in the United States and the different changes that it has gone through and the different ways it's come to be understood. So I wrote this book because, like most citizens in the United States these days, we're overwhelmingly concerned about the polarization we see in our politics and how that political polarization has really drifted into other aspects of our life. I read somewhere that even the dating apps that you could jump on will say, do you want to date somebody who's a Republican or do you want to date somebody who's a Democrat? So you can actually have a partisan polarized view of who it is that you're dating. And I was concerned for the fate of democracy, like the vast majority of American people right now. And one thing that I noticed just everywhere I went, whether I was following the 2024 presidential campaign or taking my family on a road trip down to Florida, stopping at truck stops along the way, seeing all this anti-lib stuff, make the libs cry more. I oil my gun with liberal tears. That was one of my favorite t-shirts that I saw in the panhandle of Florida. And I thought, wow, this word liberal is doing a lot of work at creating a lot of hatred and stoking a lot of fears in people about what the supposed liberals would do. And I thought about this in relation to my historical work. So I'm a history professor, as you mentioned, and I've written several books about American political and intellectual history. And my work has been overwhelmingly concerned with times when Americans found common ground, when there was a common wheel where we all sort of sensed that we were pulling in some collective effort together. I wrote about the 1930s, the 40s, and the 50s, about how the United States could create the fattest middle class that it ever has, how it could enact huge programs that would benefit vast numbers of American citizens, and that people were wildly enthusiastic about these kinds of things. And interestingly, these were done under the label of the word liberal. Liberalism was triumphant. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a historian who went on to become a speechwriter for John F. Kennedy, he wrote a book in 1949 about liberalism called The Vital Center. And so once upon a time, liberalism was the center between communism on the left and sort of authoritarian fascism on the right. And the way that the United States could not go up the horseshoe of the too far to the left or too far to the right was to sit in this comfortable center called liberalism. And so my book sort of got interested in the question of how do we go from this position when 3/4 of Americans either said they were liberal or were very comfortable, had good feelings about liberals, which was actually a poll from 1949, to a point where by the early 2000s, very, very few Americans would call themselves a liberal. Even Democrats who sort of could be understood to be operating within the so-called liberal tradition were running from the label. So what had happened to this label? And what I was really interested in was how might the transformations of this label go some way in explaining how we ended up in these extreme polarized times where we find ourselves today.
And so you write about how the word entered the vocabulary. It was FDR really who chose that word uh, because nobody really knew what it meant at the time, so you could imbue it with whatever definition you wanted.
Yeah,
Uh,
you're exactly right. That was one of the big finds of my book, was that I thought this word had sort of ancient origins and went back throughout American history to Thomas Paine and the founding era, if not even the 19th century. But what I discovered was that in the United States, I actually found the speech. I was so excited. In the summer of 1932, before then, very few Americans had used the word liberal. And whenever they did, there were sort of extended conversations about what the heck the word meant. But in the summer of 1932, in the depths of the Great Depression, when we had things like 25% unemployment throughout the nation and 50% unemployment in industrial cities like Detroit and parts of Chicago, people were looking for an answer that would help alleviate the American plight. And the proposal that we now know of as the New Deal, which FDR, of course, proposed and put into action after he was elected president in 1932, he was being attacked for being socialist or communist. So he wanted a new label. He sort of looked through the catalog of labels that were out there that were sort of open-ended and available for use. And in one speech in the summer of 1932, he used the word liberal. We need to put into effect a liberal form of government that will enable the common American to succeed and to grow and to prosper. One of his advisors, Rex Tugwell, later asked him, "Why did you pick the word liberal?" And he said, "Does it matter?" And that's the deepest we'll get on why FDR ever used that word. But once he started using it in 1932, it became the center of New Deal politics, an understanding that we live with today, where liberalism is a form of government that works to regulate the worst abuses of capitalism while upholding some of the strongest components of capitalism, providing a basic floor or safety net below which most Americans cannot fall, but from which they can individually prosper in whatever direction they want. It didn't
well,
always mean that, but that was FDR's definition.
yeah, and if you think about the context of 1932, before there was unemployment insurance, before there was Medicare and Medicaid, before there were any of these safety net programs, many of which started under FDR after he got elected in 32, we had, as you said, 25% unemployment. The financial markets had failed, banking had failed, and in the eyes of many Americans, Soviet communism didn't look that bad. Uh, it seemed like a viable alternative. And in fact, there was an active communist party in the United States that was, you know, during the Depression was actually gaining some support. So liberalism was like an alternative to that, uh,
Yeah,
more of a middle
yeah,
ground.
exactly right. And that's how FDR sort of imagined it. He saw that mayors of major towns were socialists, and the Communist Party USA was at its peak numbers. And he looked overseas, and he saw the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And a lot of Americans, especially artists and intellectuals, felt that might be a viable alternative, in a viable option as opposed to American capitalism. And what he fashioned liberalism to be, and historians have long noticed this, despite what the rhetoric about it is that this vision of 1930s liberalism was actually intended to shore up capitalism. They were not mandating apartments, but FDR went on to help create the suburbs, for instance. It wasn't taking over state ownership of numerous industries, but instead it was regulating capitalism to prevent it from succumbing to its worst abuses. It was setting up rules for banks that they had to follow, rules for insurance companies, rules for mortgage companies, rules so that capitalists would not get too greedy and destroy the capitalist enterprise. So instead, it was some sort of centrist position that would sort of push back against those who were advocating communism on the left. And then looking at the other parts of Europe, he saw the rise of Mussolini in Italy and, of course, Hitler in Germany. And he did not want to have a kind of strongman leader premised on authoritarianism. So his liberalism was this happy centrist position that would uphold capitalism while also upholding democracy.
So fast forward a little bit after the Great Depression, after World War II, one of your other books talked about the famous televised debates between William F. Buckley and Norman Mailer. Buckley, the famous conservative who founded the National Review. He was the original host of PBS Firing Line. Norman Mailer was sort of the voice of the left at the time. Talk about, you kind of credit William F. Buckley with being one of the first conservatives to weaponize the word liberal, to try and change its definition and change the way Americans viewed liberalism. Tell me a little bit more about his role and what William F. Buckley did.
Sure. So after FDR sort of creates this liberal center, a linguistic tool, but also, with a lot of public policy behind it, it was wildly successful. As I mentioned at the outset, something close to 75% of Americans either called themselves a liberal or had good feelings towards liberals. And there were notable successes. We can see the expansion of the American middle class in the 40s and 50s and 60s to its biggest percentages that we've ever seen before or since as a liberal accomplishment. We can look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Housing Rights Act of 1968 as liberal accomplishments done in conjunction with pushes from Black Americans and civil rights advocates in general, but also with a bunch of liberals self-proclaimed liberals who were in power at the time. So it was this very successful thing. Of course, it had its flaws, and I detail a number of the flaws in the book. But the flaws, which can be seen in some ways as sort of not extending the tent wide enough. Maybe there was efforts made to extend the tent of inclusion even wider, but it was not wide enough. And it also closed off certain options as far as more radical politics. So by the 1950s and 1960s, I deduced 3 lines of opposition to the liberal center. One of which, as you say, came from William F. Buckley Jr. He's known as the patron saint of the modern conservative party, the sort of leading figure of the right, who famously kind of excised the open anti-Semites and a lot of the open bigots from the right, making sort of the conservative ideology acceptable for mainstream America in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Through the National Review, through Firing Line, through the things that you suggested. And his basic line of attack was he took a moribund idea, which was conservatism in America. It was very, very minor as far as the kind of politics we know today with its libertarian small tax ethos or its sort of cultural politics. It was a very, very minor party or idea in the United States at the time. And he decided that the way that he could grow this was to chip away at what he saw the liberal center. So starting in the 1950s with National Review and several of his books, he goes on a full attack of liberals. He gives them a capital L, so they're the capital L liberals. He coins this verbiage called the liberal establishment, of course, with a capital L for liberal and a capital E for establishment. And he says the liberal establishment, this is sort of the center of his argument, has taken away the 2 C's. One is capitalism and the other is Christianity. And so the liberals are trying to usher in communism and socialism, and they're also trying to reduce our moral center into a more pluralistic ethos. So they're trying to take away capitalism and trying to take away Christianity. Now, good liberals would say none of this is true at all, but this was Buckley's argument, and it gained a lot of traction, and it gained a lot of adherents, including Whittaker Chambers or even Richard Nixon, all the way to Ronald Reagan, who said that he owed his turn to conservatism through the pages of National Review. So this has become a constant source of attack of what liberals supposedly are from the right, that we even hear today from President Donald Trump or from passerbys when Zoran Mamdani was getting on a bicycle. Somebody yelled that he was a communist. And he turned to him and said, no, I'm a cyclist, you mean, because he was riding his bike. So that was one line of attack, was from the right, and it was led by William F. Buckley. The 1959 manifesto that Buckley wrote was called Up from Liberalism, which was a distinct parallel to Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. So he was paralleling 19th century chattel slavery to 20th century liberalism. And that was the argument they were making. The second critique that I got comes from the other guy that you referred to, which was Norman Mailer, and not just Mailer alone, but also many people on the left, including Chicago's own Saul Alinsky and many of the sort of more radical left, the Jerry Rubins of this world, the Abby Hoffmans of this world. And they understood liberalism to be upholding capitalism too strongly, to being capitalism's beard, and to foreclosing the possibilities of radical politics. So famously, in the 1950s, at the height of the Red Scare, Congress outlaws the Communist Party USA, and true leftists are appalled, and they say there's been a blow struck to American democracy, and it has been struck by liberals, because liberals were actually too centrists, that they weren't embracing things like universal health care or a more universal income equality. They were sort of foreclosing the possibility. So interestingly, you have the right, people like William F. Buckley, saying liberals are actually cutting off capitalism and ushering us into socialism. But on the left, you have a critique that's saying liberalism is upholding capitalism and foreclosing the possibilities of a truly socialistic order. So that was the sort of second critique, and they both see liberals in completely different ways.
Okay, and you also mentioned one of my favorite songs from that era. Actually, there was a political satirist, Philip Ochs, OCHS, who did comedy albums and political satire songs, one of which was called Love Me, I'm a Liberal. And he defined liberals as people who are 10 degrees to the left when times are good and 10 degrees to the right when something affects them personally. Because they were so centrist within the context of the time, what you seem to be saying is they're vulnerable from attacks on both sides, not only from William F. Buckley and Whittaker Chambers and Richard Nixon on the right, but also from the civil rights movement and from the counterculture movement on the left, as that was developing in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. What were you mentioned a little bit about some of the arguments from the left. We still hear that today from what are now called progressives, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about where the word progressive came from, how that entered? Because that seemed to be, it's like today's alternative to the word liberal. If you don't want to be tagged a liberal, but somehow the word progressive is maybe a little more acceptable.
Yeah, progressive has its origins in the progressive era. I mean, obviously, the word has a much longer history than that. But as far as
back
having
125 years, yeah, to the early 20th century.
Well, yeah, as a word, it goes back even farther than that. But as far as having political meaning in the United States, yeah, it goes back to the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, when there was the first outcry against the ravages of the industrial order. People saw the industrialists, the sort of economic oligarchs, as they were sometimes called, the sort of J.P. Morgans and the Cornelius Vanderbilts of the world, who had concentrated so much wealth that they had sort of built these huge palatial mansions and were showing off these incredible displays of wealth while leaving aside any sort of responsibility for social order. And so a group of mostly middle-class people, especially women who were lacking outlets for their professional ambitions at the time. This is, of course, before even first wave feminism of the 1910s and 1920s was a substantive thing. They joined progressive era movements, trying to do things like make sure that cities were picking up garbage from poor neighborhoods, or making sure there were actually public schools in neighborhoods where immigrants were moving to. So Jane Addams, of course, is Chicago's famous progressive era leader who starts Hull House, which is on my campus at UIC. And it's a famous, wonderful place for me to take my students, recently remodeled, I should say. So this was sort of this notion that progressive people are going to challenge what is seen as the industrial order. And when liberal became a bad word in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, in part because of the criticism that I've already described from the right and the criticism that I've seen from the left. And there was a third line of criticism that came out of the civil rights movement, which was saying that white liberals especially are all talk, not enough action. They will do what they can to bring about the legalistic end of segregation, but they don't want to truly bring about equality. And mostly they're elitist snobs who don't want to give up anything that really will cost them in the name of the greater good. A line of argument, I should say, that was picked up by the feminist movement, that was picked up by the gay rights movement, that was picked up by the pro-Palestine movement, and most interestingly, in my mind, that was also picked up by the angry white working classes of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, that liberals are mostly elitists who talk a good game, but they don't actually follow through. And so we need to look elsewhere for people who are going to help us. After those three lines of attack from the left, from the right, and from those who are sort of outside the circle of the we, ranging all the way from the white working class to Black civil rights advocates, there was this sense that liberalism was a word that could not be used politically effectively. So in 2007, we have lots of people trying to claim to be progressive, most famously, of course, and I tell the story in my book, when Hillary Clinton, Illinois' own Hillary Clinton, when she was asked if she was a liberal when she was running for president in 2007, of course, she would lose the nomination to another guy named Barack Obama. But when she was running against Obama for the Democratic Party's nomination, a reporter asked her what was thought to be a gotcha question, are you a liberal? And she said, no, that word used to mean you were for freedom, but it's come to suggest that you are for big government and you're a elitist snob. I prefer to call myself a progressive, a good American progressive. And so you can see her running from the label liberal because it had been so much burdened with all of this outsized verbiage that nobody wanted to call themselves a liberal. And people were testing out whether or not progressive would be a good replacement. Alas, after Hillary Clinton said it, and for the last 15 to 20 years since then, the word is not really caught on as describing a centrist position in American life. And instead, progressive is deemed to be too far to the left to be something that the Democratic Party comfortably feels it wants to use in order to bind together its sort of left-wing, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Zoran Mamdani components with its more centrist components that would embody somebody like Hakeem Jeffries or maybe even Hillary Clinton.
So here in Illinois, it seems as though this is one area of the country where the demonization of the word liberal hasn't really taken hold. I mean, just earlier this week, Governor Pritzker signed into law a bill that grants protections to immigrants. It sort of walls off certain areas, including state courthouses, from immigration enforcement actions. He describes himself, I think, as a pragmatic progressive or a pragmatic liberal. How do you suppose Illinois has escaped this trend, or maybe it's just certain pockets of Illinois where liberalism is still acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple things. One, I mean, Illinois has historically been, at least in the last couple decades, a safe blue state where people are comfortable playing with words that might be dangerous in purplish states or even red states. So I think that language has been more viable in Illinois. And I would also say that we have a long history of labor advocacy and supporting our labor unions. And one of the sort of largest groups that was first included in the liberal tent, going back all the way to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, were labor unions and the CIO and the later AFL-CIO when they joined forces together. And I think that sort of history continues in Illinois. But I would also say something else, that I don't think Illinois has fully successfully avoided running from the label liberal. None of our longstanding senators have called themselves liberals recently. And in the polling data, which of course as a scholar I watch, there was a brief uptick. The number of Americans who claimed to be liberal fell below 20% and was in the teens for a while. And in 2016, of course, when Donald Trump is first elected president, there is this uptick in people who call themselves liberal in opposition to sort of Trumpism. And then that dipped down again when Joe Biden was president, and it popped back up again in 2024. So there seems to be some viability of a word like liberal when there is a strong opposition, such as Donald Trump and his oppositional politics that is currently in power. That said, I think the Democratic Party has long been searching for a word that will describe its centrist philosophy. It hasn't found it since liberal was deemed sort of a bad word that people don't want to grasp onto. And I think that, I mean, more than just marketing, of course, but I think from a marketing perspective, it is a part of it. That has been one of the reasons that the Democratic Party has not been able to coalesce the left and the center left and create a full-scale opposition to the Trumpist march on the right.
Okay, so in just the few minutes that we have left here, you do end your book by talking about how maybe we need new language, we need a new word or some new way to describe uh, that wing of American political thought. Have you come up with anything yet?
I do think we have great linguistic impoverishment in how we describe the center of American politics today. And I was actually driving to a hockey tournament with my daughter, and she is taking Latin in high school. And we went through her Latin dictionary to see if we could find another word, because the origin of the word liberalism is Latin for liber, which means free, which is the root of that word. So what could possibly sit at the root? And alas, we did not find anything in her dictionary. I go through a few possibilities at the end of my book, none of which I'm terribly optimistic about, but I do actually spend some time discussing the possibilities. And I want points for this because I put this forward several months ago, a year ago. I put forward the language of social democracy, because the word democracy plays to our individual instincts as Americans who seek individualistic freedoms, but also our notion that we are part of a greater society. So social democracy has the language that balances that. And since I sort of put that forward, it emerges that, do you know who the most popular politician in America is right now by polling data? It's Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the United States, and he proudly calls himself a democratic socialist out of the social democratic tradition. Zoran Mamdani got elected mayor of New York. The newly elected mayor of Seattle also calls herself a social democrat. So I don't know if this word is going to make a run for it, but I do think that there is some possibility that it could be something out there. Although, that said, I would say that the right has been bound together by another neologism that didn't have any life before just 10 years ago, and that is MAGA, Make America Great Again. And so who knows what the left will find to put on its blue-colored hats.
Kevin Schultz from the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's the author of the new book, Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals, A History. It's available from the University of Chicago Press. Professor Schultz, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Great chat.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.